Okay, good evening everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. So my name is Jane Hirschfield. I'm the principal of St George's University, and with such a role there become pleasures and pains, and I can promise you that introducing inaugural lectures is in the pleasure, and particularly Iain, it's been terrific. You're one of the people I've got to know through coming to St George's, and how much I have enjoyed what you've taught me, and what a wonderful ambassador you are for us.
Thank you.
You obviously have a very important role as head of school, and I looked through your CV and I hadn't realised just how many illustrious places you've been. No doubt we'll hear about it, but King's, Brunel, the Army, UCL and ourselves, to name but a few. You're also, thank you very much family and friends, lovely to see you here too. I hope you understand most of the lectures. One of the comments often is, "That was great, Dad, I didn't understand much of it," so we'll have to see how that goes. You are a tweeter. I had a look at your feed. The first thing is, it was very sanitary. There was no admonishment required. It was absolutely perfect. Many hashtags, as you might expect, around the Council of Heads of Deans, where you're treasurer, NHS England. You're obviously interested in leadership because that features a number of times. So we're going to hear more about you as the man and as the colleague. We look forward to the lecture. Just so everybody knows, it's an inaugural, so there aren't questions at the end, but what there is at the end are refreshments. So when Iain has finished, Andy Kent is going to come up and give the vote of thanks, and then we'd very much like you all to join us to have an informal question and answer session upstairs. Thank you very much, Iain.
Thank you, Jenny. So we just need to go to there. Am I on? Can you hear at the back? Am I on? Have I pressed mute or not? Does that put me on or off? That puts me off. Right, I'm back on. Okay, thank you so much everybody for coming. It's really good to see you. I tell you, this sort of thing would only ever happen once in your life, where the people mostly it's the people that you've invited to come. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. Jane, thank you. Well, I know you had a conflict with someone else. I really appreciate people coming and doing that. The title, I tried to make it what I thought was simple, and I had a conversation with my daughter on the way to school about a month ago, to which I was asked, why did you have to make it rather complicated? I said, well, you know what stimulus means, don't you? To which the answer was no. And I realised that I couldn't actually very simply answer the question, so I'm probably not going to try and answer it, other than that stimulus is really something that happens which may well produce a response. Whether it's the full best example, or whether it's the best descriptor of what I'm going to talk about, you'll find as we go along. This is really my journey, right, from cradle to grave to some degree. So what have I done with my work life, really, I suppose what you would say. Well, if you have me at the top there, 0 to 10, and I'm now 58. If you look at the 0 to 10, at 9 years, 9 months, at the pretty much at the end of my time at prep school, because I didn't really like it very much, actually the report was, doing really well, coming on very promising. You look at my reports through 10 to 18, not so good. I didn't respond personally very well to a breakup of my parents, and I just didn't really get motivated in my teenage years, which means I probably never went through this process. And for anyone who's interested in teenage brains, Sarah Jane Blakemore, she's a professor up at UCL. This only came out in March. Really interesting, though fascinating. I did tweet her on this, is how little we actually know. She's been doing this for about 10-15 years now, and it's quite clear that we don't actually know that much about what happens with teenage brains, but actually it is very different, and it's different than what we used to know. So what have I done with my work life since then, since 18? Well, it's 40 years ago since I left school, literally probably this month. I think I was just about to finish my A-levels. It's also today, literally the day and the date, 16 years to when I had my PhD viva up at UCL. literally. So when Caroline offered me the 20th of June, I absolutely grabbed it. I thought, that's great. So what have I been doing since then? Well, again, if you go from top to bottom, and my qualifications are on the left-hand side. So I was in the Army, as Jenny said, Joint Services School of Physiotherapy. I then did a certificate in education at Thames Polytechnic, which is now University of Greenwich. That qualified me to get a diploma in teaching physiotherapy from the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. I then did an MSc in biomedical engineering at Surrey University. My PhD at University of London it is, but through with Phil at UCL, of which we will hear more later. And then recently I've been on a programme at Cranfield University, Personal Transformation for Leaders. As Jenny said, I'm quite interested in leadership. And in terms of my actual work career, well, I started out working at Royal Surrey County Hospital as a nursing auxiliary in those days. Not a nursing associate, all the names seem to change quite a lot. I then went into the Army to become a physiotherapist. An interesting way in, and if any of the admissions tutors were here tonight, they would have a fit that I really got in because Chaz Jones, who went there, was the major in charge of the Army, really liked rugby, and so did I. So we had about 20 minutes on rugby, 5 minutes on yes, you'll do, and then I got in. Really interesting beginning to my career. After getting out of the Army, I then went to Kingston Hospital, where I ran the outpatient department for 2 years, and then 30 years ago, I started at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. I'm absolutely delighted that Helen Schaffner is here tonight, and John, her husband. Helen was were you called principal, Helen? Was principal, wasn't it, of the School of Physiotherapy at St Mary's. From there, because they closed it down, in the commissioning world as was at the time, I then went to Brunel University. I then had a year out where I was working in a private practice physiotherapy with Jenny Hawke. Peter, her husband, is here tonight. I then moved to King's and was there for 13 years, and that's where I got my PhD. As you can see, there's a timeline. And then I've been here in Kingston for 9 years. So I think it's worthwhile just setting the context a little bit. I'm going to take a little time just to do this so that everyone knows, what does a professor profess? Why are they called professors? Well, I suspect that most of society wants them actually to give answers, an insight into what we know. But to get answers, the one thing you have to do is ask questions. And the reason that I make the distinction of that is that probably what I do more than anything is ask questions. Even to the point in the first Senate that Jenny chaired, I had to ask some quite hard questions about the physiotherapy programme, and eventually Jenny had to say, no Ian, I think that's enough now, but we got our way. So I had to ask those questions. Really interesting conversation that we had about being a professor over at Kingston in January with the professoriate. And what came out was that what professors really do is operate at the boundaries of what we know, the boundaries of evidence. And I really quite like that model, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it more now. If you look here, I've actually put this together. There are 5 things that universities tend to use, or both Kingston and St George's use anyway, for judging where you are as a professor. And it's to do with learning and teaching, as you might expect, research, enterprise, it's a term that's sort of going out a bit, but being enterprising, really, doing that which is outside of standard education, professional practice, which is external engagement, and then leadership. And I've just sort of marked myself on there as to how we put the application together, and you can see that I really got this on the basis that I do a lot of professional practice, externally, quite a bit of leadership and teaching, some research, and enterprise. So what am I going to spend most of the time talking about tonight? Yes, I'm going to talk about the research, but hopefully it will actually lead into giving some insights. Just to give an insight into where I come from and what sort of underpins me, and I think this probably, to be honest, came from my dad. There's a number of things really. The Royal Society has a motto, take nobody's word for it, and I try to aspire to that. If somebody says something, I want to make that question behind it. I've always been really intrigued by this, and I've tried to say this to my children. I don't think they really listen very much. Isidore Rabai, Nobel Prize winner, he actually worked out magnetic resonance on why he became a scientist. My mother made me a scientist without ever knowing it. Every other child would come back from school and be asked, what did you learn today? But my mother used to say, did you ask a good question today? And he would aspire that to having got the Nobel Prize, because that made the difference. It made him ask good questions. Now, I'm not going to read through all of the rest. I just want to give you 10 or 15 seconds if anybody knows who said all of this. It was in pretty much one quote. This is probably my biggest hero. We'll turn down the lights. Yes, thank you, Jenny. That's a good idea. While you're doing that, I'll do that. Thank you. So, is that about the right one? Perfect. Does that mean you can all see now? Does that mean you haven't been able to see at all up to now? I'm not going back. Anybody know who said that? No. Greatest communicator of science, in my opinion, there's ever been, Richard Feynman. Absolutely stunning. If you go on YouTube, there's a 2-part horizon, just the business. You think about what he's saying there, particularly that last bit. I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. That's a really, really pithy thing to have said, isn't it? And really interesting. I'm actually going to come back to that later on because I think there's a challenge for us as health professions, and I am a professor in health education, so I really ought to address that. So altogether, underneath it, I would like to think that I aspire to take nobody's word for it, ask good questions, and embrace not knowing and doubt. And there's a number of people in the school that we work with now who really embrace that a lot, not knowing. This doesn't mean that I've gone Buddhist, for those who know that I'm a Christian and I'm a churchgoer, but actually this quote fits as a framework for what I'm going to say today. I'm actually just going to change it round a bit, but underneath it, my research has really been about the fact that everything's connected, and that it does change, and that paying attention is a useful way forward. So you'll see that that's the structure of what's to come. So let's get into the research and where it comes. So it starts really with talking about nerves and the physical connections of the nerves. We'll then go, oh, that's not right, it's pressed, okay, and then the abdominal muscles, and then into the reflex work that I did with Phil when I was doing the PhD. Late 1980s, early 1990s, I've been qualified as a physiotherapist for about 10 years. There's a lot going on about, actually, is there something about the physicality of the nervous system rather than just the fact that it sends messages that was there? The really interesting question here, which is still prevalent now, is on the left-hand side. Nearly a century later, that study from Mixter and Barr in the New England Journal of Medicine, which was based on some really poor data and very inaccurate, that image still means that a lot of back pain is attributed to disc problems and this disc pushing out. The problem with that is that if you took x-rays of all of you who haven't got pain, you'd find that there was an awful lot of that there. Now, the fact that that disc is pressing out and onto the nervous system, which is all connected all the way down, means that when you do something like this, when you from there you straighten someone's knee, you pull the foot down and you raise the hip up, what that does is it pulls the nerve. But what we didn't know was how much of a change in length there was for that nerve when you did that manoeuvre. So what we did, as part of my MSc in biomedical engineering, I was working up at Imperial at the time, in some areas, and they had advanced trauma life support of cadavers there, which meant that they were fixed in a way that didn't keep them, that meant that they were floppy. So we could actually it was actually a strimmer wire down the back of the nerve, and we could then go through this manoeuvre in a pretty rigorous way in the way that we designed it. I've spared you the pictures, to work out how much the nerve had to accommodate when you went through all of that movement. And what we ended up with, and I won't bore you with it for too long, is that the whole thing is about 4 inches change. So if you move your leg from there right through to there, and you can see I can't get mine all the way up, there's about 4 inches change on average that the nerve has to accommodate for. That's a lot. That's an awful lot. I then went through with a load of students over the next few years on BSc and MSc programs, going through different manoeuvres, testing it on patients, testing out how you stretch these nerves and how that felt. And we characterised that with those students, not a student body, but in a pain-free subject, as to what it would be like if it wasn't painful, so that when you then did it with patients, you would actually then get an idea as to what the problems might be. And then we did some work with 3 qualified physiotherapists on the MSc Advanced Physiotherapy, which I was running at the time at King's, where we identified whether people were likely to have a problem with their nerve from the answers that they gave to questions. Did they have things like pins and needles, tingling? What was it like when you had the back pain? What did that feel like? And there was a way of characterising that via a questionnaire. And what we ended up finding out through all of them, because this straight leg raise test had gone out of vogue a little bit, was that if you had neuropathic pain, and I've deliberately put that in the red there, if you had neuropathic pain, you actually couldn't move your leg up as much as you could before. Whereas if you didn't have neuropathic pain, actually the movement was much better. And there was a group where we weren't really quite sure whether they had neuropathic pain or not. And that's my highest impact journal, going into pain. Really neat little study, actually. I was really proud of that. Working with these 3 students, they were working across Kent, Surrey and Sussex, because they were very advanced, very senior physiotherapists. Really useful bit of work that we did there. I'm just going to very slightly get ahead of myself here, and there is a schematic of what a reflex looks like, and we're going to come back to that. So hopefully you can recognise there's a leg, there's the muscles in the calf, and there is one of those reflex hammers that you would often use. And what that does is it stretches the muscle, and you then get activity going up this nerve here. Now I'm going to come back to that later on, but it's this nerve here that I just want to focus on now, because just before I left King's we were working within the MRI unit there, and what we did was we imaged this part of the pathway where all those, what they're called dorsal root ganglia, where all these cells aggregate together. And this, I don't know whether you can see the detail there, but that's the equivalent of the cell body. This is the nerve wrapped on top of each other, just gone backwards and forwards, a bit like a concertina. That's how long the nerve is at either end compared to where the cell body is. Nerves are incredibly long. So what we did is we then imaged that with MRI, and you can just, hopefully you can just see there are the vertebral column, there's the vertebrae and the discs, and there are those dorsal root ganglia. I then move on, and the work we would look around in terms of the abdominal muscles. Now, just showing you this because this is what it looks like when a muscle is contracting. So this is the electrical activity that you would get. And this here is about a very little bit of that. It's somewhere embedded in that group down there. So there is the activity going on in the muscle, and when a muscle is contracting, the more it contracts, the more activity you get. So this is someone turning from the left and to the right, and this is with their abdominal muscles. And that's what the whole thing then looks like. Generally, we tend to record that using that electrical activity. There was a bit of work that we did using ultrasound scanning, the sort that's used within obstetrics in terms of prenatal. And what we did, I've gone the wrong way there. What we did was we looked at the thickness of the muscle and then saw whether that correlated with when people actually moved. So if you actually contract the muscle, does it get bigger? It's a little bit like if you do that with your muscles, you've got your guns coming in there, which somebody actually said to me the other day, didn't they? Said, Ian, you've got good guns, to which neither my wife or I really agreed, really. I'm not quite sure he was being quite kind. But you do actually get that contraction. It's slightly different in these muscles here, and we did quite a bit of work looking at this using ultrasound as a measure, so that we could then use that to measure the function of the abdominal muscles. And I'm not going to go into the details of that particularly, other than to say this, and we'll come back to this later on when we look at the reflexes. Hopefully this makes sense. If you're looking at the front of someone, this is a schematic of the abdomen. So you have the ribs here, you have the pelvis here, you have your rectus abdominis, your six-pack, which is there with all of us, it just doesn't show necessarily. And here are the abdominal muscles, and the blue is what's called the external abdominal oblique. It comes from here and goes downwards. The red is what's called the internal abdominal oblique and comes across from the pelvis. And the black is a very deep muscle called transversus abdominis, which those of you who do Pilates, you've probably had that spoken to you about. It's supposedly a very important muscle that if you can isolate the contraction of that, what we actually did with all of this work was show that really you can't isolate the contraction of it. And the reason you can't isolate the contraction of it is because if you then look down on it, so this is then looking as if you're going into the screen, there's the transversus abdominis, there's the internal oblique, there's the external oblique. You can see that actually they are all connected via a mesh. So if this muscle contracts, it's going to pull on the others anyway. It's not really possible to isolate the contraction of it. So for those of you who still do Pilates, it doesn't mean it's not good to do it, but you're probably not isolating it in the way that you think you are. And a lot of the ultrasound work demonstrated that for us. So we now get on to the PhD work and the neurological connections. And so I've done this as pictorially as I can. Obviously Phil was my main PhD supervisor, Caroline my co-conspirator, where we used to look out and have coffees when we didn't want to ask the questions that we really felt were rather stupid of Phil. I'm sure you would have been fine with it, Phil, but sometimes we really felt, no, that is just too dumb. And then there were some other students there who we worked with at King's. So we go back to this. And the essence of the PhD was looking at stretch reflexes. Not in these muscles, it was in the abdominal muscles, but this is the model that I want to just use as a demonstrator, and then at some point we'll just take off and take this and I'll extrapolate and go probably far too far for what we actually know, but this is about ideas, this is about what underpins where I've gone in the rest of my career. So, you stretch a muscle by tapping on it, you stretch the muscle spindle there, which can be very sensitive, and the message goes back up there, and that then connects via what's called a synapse, one nerve on the other nerve, and then excites that and makes the muscle contract. In effect, unmodified, with all of us, if that happened and we didn't stop that, you wouldn't move anywhere at all, because as soon as your muscle gets longer, there's a built-in system that says stop moving. It's really quite weird, and my understanding, Phil, I don't know whether you still know, whether we still really know what the stretch reflex is for. That was certainly what was going on when we were looking at it in detail. So we applied this then to the abdominal muscles. And this is how we started it. So if we look on the bottom right here, there you have the muscles at the bottom of the back. So hopefully that's recognisable as a back. And this is the equivalent of one of those reflex hammers. It's a device that just prods in effect and stretches the muscle, and you then record the activity. And this is what the activity looks like. So that's background electrical activity. There you then get this reflex, and then it goes back to nothing again. That is an incredibly short reflex. It's less than 10 milliseconds, not 9.3 milliseconds. I've deliberately chosen the person who got the shortest reflex. Most of them are slightly longer than that, but that's incredibly short. That's less than the motor racing 1/100th of a second. That's really, really short. If you want to see how short, there's a second, and there's the reflex. So I've tried to keep it. You see, we just concertinaed it over to the left. That's how quick that reflex is. If with all of that activity, what you do is make all the activity positive, whether it's going below or above the line, what you get is a different way of expressing it, where that shows the activity in the same way. And the reason that you do that is that when we then wanted to look and see what the activity was on the opposite side of the back, you then get that. And what that means is that there you've got an excitation. There's excitatory activity going on in the muscle. The muscle is being encouraged to contract. The muscle on the opposite side, over here, is being inhibited. It's being reduced. And that's a well-known mechanism. So really no great surprise there, though we did, when I say we got that published, I feel like I have to thank you for that. You allowed me to be single author on that paper, even though we'd done the work together. So when that got published, it wasn't any really great shakes. But the paper that was the one we did before that, which is exact similar protocol, but tapping on the muscle here. And remember I talked about this internal oblique muscle here on the inside of the pelvis. So you can see what's happening there is we're stretching, and you're then getting this activity. And actually that looks a lot cleaner than the previous one, doesn't it? That looks a bit messy. It looks, there's not that much of it. These are very, very potent reflexes. And I can still remember the day, and most scientists will say they can still remember the day when they had a real aha moment, where they were the only person in the world who knew that, where I was doing this experiment on myself, and I was recording the activity in both muscles, one on each side, and that's what came out. Still remember it now, and actually I shouted so loud that Di Newham, my professor, came in and said, "Ian, what's gone wrong? Are you all right?" And I said, "Look at that, Di." Now that, if we then take that on, is the complete opposite to what happens in the muscles on the back. So what we characterised was that the muscles on the front are wired, if you like, or connected differently than they are on the back. That's not really been shown before, and this strength of reflex had never really been shown before. We've only repeated it once in the jaw muscles when working with Roger Linden at King's before he retired. But that was quite unique. And what it did was explain what we talked about before, which was the anatomical connections of those muscles. And what does that do? Well, Georgina, this is where I said I was going to talk to you about it. We're pretty sure now that what those reflexes are there to do is to stabilise the pelvis. And the reason I say that, Georgina's our head of department of midwifery. I've often wondered what being pregnant does to these reflexes. I've never looked at it, and you probably wouldn't get ethics to be poking and prodding in that sort of area. But actually, it's a really intriguing question as to what might happen to it, and particularly how vulnerable the women might be after they've given birth if they're dependent upon reflexes which have been stretched. Suddenly, it's not stretched. Is there a vulnerability with that? And it may be that underlies some of the problems that women see postpartum. Okay. So where does this most of it happen? We're just about to go stratospheric now. Okay, and this is where the ideas are coming out. And with David here, I suspect, David, you're going to say I'm going far too far in terms of the data, and absolutely I am. But I'm trying to explain my career and my journey. So, what we've done is simplistically put this together and said, okay, that's what monosynaptic reflexes look like. Comes in, it goes onto there, very simple, and goes back down. The reality, and I think this is one of the best pictures in science, I think it's one of the most undersold pictures in science, is that. That is a nerve cell similarly positioned with all its little tentacles. They're actually called dendrites, and those connections from here could attach anywhere on all of that on either side of the spinal cord. Now, if the technicalities of that feel a lot, the reality is it ain't like that. It's not just one simple thing. There's lots of opportunities for whether that nerve fires and creates a contraction or whether it doesn't. So the reality is there's a lot of variation there as to when these muscles will work and contract. And I said that reflex here was very potent only if it's in standing. If you try and get that reflex in these muscles here when someone's lying, not a chance. You won't get anything. It just doesn't happen. The body down-regulates. It doesn't need the reflex at that point. It may be why people who have sacroiliac joint problems have problems when they're turning in bed, because the muscles aren't there, but it's all gone down and then they turn and suddenly there's a problem. So, culmination of my argument that everything is connected. The stretch reflex was evoked in these muscles. So somebody was sitting and you just evoke that stretch reflex. When I say evoke, you tap it and you create the activity, you stretch the muscle, you create the reflex, and you measure the size of the reflex depending upon whether you have just looked at images that are either pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. The person is in completely the same position. Nothing has changed. But what's changed is what they've seen and what their mind is connecting. How they're perceiving that. So reflexes can be affected by what you see. Nothing else. Reflexes can be affected by what you see. So reflexes in those muscles are vulnerable, if not vulnerable, they are amenable to what we see, to how we engage, to where our mind is at. Throughout my PhD write-up in that last 6 months, when I was doing 15 hours a day, and Avril was wondering whether she was ever going to get to talk to me again, I was continually in my mind going, am I writing reflex or do I write response? Is it reflex or is it response? So I'm going more and more abstract now. For anyone who fancies an interesting read, this is a really, really good book. It's about 22 years old now. But Descartes basically said there's a mind and there's a body, and the two are not together. They are separate. So I'm going quite philosophical now. He said there was a mind and a body, and they separate. The reality is he debunked that with going through very rigorous evidence to suggest that actually the two things are together. Everything is connected. There is a connection between mind and body. You can see I've gone off in a slightly weird direction here. I'm a professor in health education. Where does that fit? We are still, in this country, being affected by what we call the medical model, which is that symptomology is caused by disease. There must be something in the body. Actually, it's nonsense, and it isn't helpful, and certainly as a family, and I suspect for all of you as well, is what it leads to is fragmented care, because if they say, oh, well, there's a problem with your bones, then you just go to an orthopaedic surgeon. But actually there may be a neurological component, there may be a respiratory component, there may be something else. There are many parts of the body, if you like, which actually are vulnerable to, which are made up by different systems. And our medical model just doesn't work, because it segregates the body as if it's not all one. And I'm pushing the boundaries here. I'm going to push them even more in a minute. A way out of this was the biopsychosocial model that was put together, where you say, actually we're all one. But even in this, you can see that there are still boundaries. There's the neurophysiology, and there's the behaviour, and then there's the social. So it's the biological, the psychological, and the social. And it's saying, actually, all of those are one, but actually they've still got some lines, haven't they? You're still separating them out as if there's one, and actually that's what happened, is a lot of it was just cherry-picked and said, oh, the biopsychosocial model, yeah, but it's a biological problem with that person, oh, it's a psychological problem, oh, that's the social problem. Actually, we're all as one, and that's what I'm suggesting here. And I'm now taking a big risk, because my boss is going to be closing this, and he's an eminent psychiatrist, and you're probably going to tell me that you know Edward Bulmore, do you, Andy, or not?
I don't, so you're on safe.
This is new. This has only been out a month. But his contention, attacking the mind-body thing even more, is that when you see depressed patients, you will pretty much always see people who have got high markers of inflammation. And his proposal is that depression is actually caused by inflammation. Completely across the mind-body thing. Knocks it out the window in some ways, if it's right. Now, I'm sure it's not fully demonstrated as yet, but that's a really, really intriguing book. I'm only halfway through it because I've been spending the rest of the time putting this together, so I'm looking forward to getting back to it, because I think it knocks at a whole load of things. And where does that leave us? It leaves us more with patient pathways. I haven't really been commenting on what's on the right-hand side, but we're away from the medical model there, and we're more to patient pathways, and hopefully less fragmented care. So in the future, might it be that people who've got depression will be sent to an immunologist, or people with inflammation might be sent to a psychiatrist properly, or they work together. Fantastic thoughts, really, around mind and body, and the fact that we are connected. And as a professor in health education, I need to point that out, that that's a potential effect. Okay, that's the connection bit. The rest of them don't go on quite as long. How are we doing time-wise? No, it's okay. Actually, it's going all right. So, as I've gone along the journey over the last 30 years in higher education, educating the workforce, the other thing that's changed, and the bigger thing that's changed with everything that I've talked about with connectivity, because obviously it's what I did, this is the big news. This is the one that we're all beginning to get to, but I'm not sure we've really asked the fundamental questions. Fantastic neurologist, neuroscientist in the 19th century, Cahal, who mapped the nervous system in many ways, was well ahead of the game before they could actually identify that there were such things as synapses. At the beginning of the 20th century, he made a statement based on the evidence that was there, which was, actually, I don't think this ever changes. I think it's always fixed as it is. And actually, as far as I can tell, because he was so great, that dogma lasted until the 1990s. So there was me qualifying between 1979 and 1982. How much change was there in the system? Oh yeah, muscle. Well, that's self-evident as physiotherapists. If we don't believe that muscle changes, then we're all over the place. Around the same time, or just before that really, we worked out with all the astronauts that there was a problem in terms of bone, is that if you weren't in a gravity system, then actually there was a massive change and you started peeing out calcium and your bones degenerated, or degenerated is the wrong word, but they became much less strong and actually were liable to fractures, which is why you see all the astronauts doing all the exercise all the time. So we knew that part of the system there, but the dogma was no, the nervous system, it's not plastic, it's fixed. Once you developed it from 0 to 10 and then through your teenage years, that's it. It's all fixed. Finally, in the 1990s, the evidence that had been there, and a lot of it had been there in the 20th century, but people had ignored it. And this is it's a warning really to all of us as in science and interested in evidence. It's really easy to ignore evidence. Really easy to ignore evidence for a whole century. But now that we know that there is such a thing as neuroplasticity, and that's a really easy little book to read. It's now on my wife's bedside table rather than mine, because I've got through it really quickly. It's a really nice little book by Moab Costandi. A bit technical, but really helpful. We now know that actually the nervous system is incredibly plastic. And I'm going to give one or two examples of that. The first one relates to muscle. So just a little explanation. May not need to worry about looking too much at the chart. What we've got here is a series of about 15 or 16 studies from the late 19th century right through until the early 2000s, where there was a measure of people who did exercise to strengthen the muscle on one side of the body, but only on that side of the body for a period of time. That was all they did, just that side, not the other side. The object of the exercise was to measure whether there was an increase in strength in the muscle on the opposite side, which had had no change in its activity. And what this shows is, yes, this aggregates all the data across all of those studies and brings it together and shows that actually there's about a 5 to 8% increase in the muscle strength on the opposite side of the body from the one which was exercised. That is not a muscle mechanism. That has to be the nervous system. But it was being ignored throughout the whole of the 20th century. But it's a truism. It's there. It's pretty clear evidence, isn't it? It's not a massive effect, but it happens. There's something going on in the nervous system there rather than just within the muscles. I've only picked out 2 or 3 of these examples, but this is a beautiful one, which 2004 I think it was? Yes, 2004, where juggling, and then prior to the juggling and then after the juggling, they did brain scans to look at the size of the parts of the brain which would be involved in that sort of coordinated activity, and lo and behold, it showed that it changes if you do juggling. The other classic study on that was the London taxi drivers, where they found that the part of the brain which was about navigation was much bigger in taxi drivers than it was in others. The nervous system really is plastic. This is my favourite study, but it is a little bit technical, so please don't worry about the technical sides of it. I'll point to the bits that are really important. 2 of them. One, tubey grip. We've all probably had tubey grip, and most of us in the physiotherapy profession can probably think, waste of space. Why do we even bother with tubey grip? What's that really doing? What's that about? Well, actually, if what you do is you stimulate the fingers, and you then record where that activity is processed within the brain, and you do it before you put the tubey grip on, and then while the tubey grip is on, and then again afterwards, what you get, if you look at the top here, is that initially the brain says, okay, well that's about how far apart the processing is at its peak. When you put the tubey grip on, the brain seems to get confused. Can you see you can't even see the difference there between the pink and the blue. Do I need to put the lights down for that one? Can you see that? You see there's no gap. There's a gap. There's no gap after half an hour. Another half an hour, the brain has then separated them out even more. It's like it's searching for a way to be able to distinguish between them. Guys, this is with tubey grip on. This is almost nothing, is what we would say, but actually it's having a massive effect on the brain. And as long as it stays on, that gap stays, and then you take it off and it goes back to where it was before. So just putting tubey grip on has a massive effect on the brain in the short term. The previous examples were ones that were happening over weeks and months. This happens in half an hour. The point I'm trying to make is the brain is incredibly plastic and changeable. And where does that change happen? I'm not going to go into the major details about it, other than to say most of it happens around the synapses, and that's to do with all change. And primarily it's synaptic where, and this is where I do go back to the title, where there's a stimulus on one side, a response, and that there's a gap in between them. And that's why I'm going to come back to that in a while. It's also worth just noting in terms of current evidence, this isn't just about the nerves. Nerves have tissues around them that are there to support them, and that's what we've thought for many years. Actually, the situation is much more dynamic than that. The supporting and surrounding tissue is playing a very active part in the nervous system. Again, this boundary between the nervous system and anything outside it is quite frankly bunkum. And we're finding out more and more about how connected we are. You're beginning to get the feeling that I understand, or I believe that we are connected. So where does the change happen? Well, it does happen there, within those synapses. Interestingly, we know that that changes around the synapse are there in terms of learning. We still don't actually know the full mechanism of it. We know that more synapses are there if you use things, and they go if you don't, but we're not quite sure what the actual mechanism is. So, are we fixed or changeable? And I'm now going off into another world. This is partly because of where my journey has taken me. So, are we fixed or are we changeable? I have to be honest, my question over the last 10 years has been, what's the limitations of change within the nervous system? What is the limitation? And for me, this is now getting into the psychological, behavioural, managerial learning environment. And I'm really grateful for David Baddiel here, another Horizon programme about 10 years ago, where he was looking into his children's development, and he came across the work of Carol Dweck from the USA, and this idea of fixed and growth mindset. And the only applause I've ever got for a lecture here, apart from when I stood up, although I think that was probably for Jenny, not for me, was when I played at the beginning of the year for some of the physiotherapy students a video by Carol Dweck talking about the power of yet. Is that if we express things in terms of when it said, oh, I can't do this, if you add on the word yet, and my daughters will be saying, oh no, he's not saying it again, is he? There's the power of yet. I can't do this yet. And when they found this from the children who were really determined that they were going to learn even when they faced with a big challenge. They didn't back off it and go, oh, I can't do it. And this idea of a growth mindset fits perfectly with the idea that we are neuroplastic and that actually nothing is ever the same again. And actually that's true. It's true in the universe generally, isn't it? But it's true within us as well. So if we think, actually this is me and my muscles have always been like this or my body's always been like this, actually it's not. It has changed. You're all different even than when we started at the beginning of the lecture and even a few minutes ago. Things have changed. If you are interested in anything that I'm saying, then that will have changed things in your brain and some of the way that your connections are there. So I would contend that nothing is ever the same again. Though when I Googled this to say, I wonder if that is a statement that's come from anybody, this is what I got, which was a quote from Alan Ball, the Everton player, which is once Everton touches you, nothing is ever the same again. And my daughter and I would probably agree with that. We're both Everton fans for our sins. Although Jordan Pickford did okay in goal the other night for England. So, if nothing is ever the same again, is stimulus response ever the same again? Is it predictable? And the reality is no, it's context specific. All stimulus response is context specific. So, my contention would be that we are connected and we're increasingly seeing that everything is connected and interdependent and that change happens continually, including within the nervous system, which we used to think was a no-go area. What that means for rehabilitation, I'm a physiotherapist, and so I will talk about that just for a little bit. What that means for rehabilitation is a massive change in the way that we do things compared to the way we did them when I qualified. In fact, when both Karen and I, were you 3 years beyond me, Karen, I think, there is? Massive change to the potential for what we might be able to do as humans, and actually you wonder whether underlying the reason that we can't do it is because we believe we can't. Now I'm really beginning to get outside my area of expertise. So let's go back to what I talked about earlier. What does a professor profess? They operate at the boundaries. I'm about to move into my career here at Kingston St George's and thinking a little bit about at the boundaries. here we come back to the paying attention. For those who love their cricket, Brian Johnson used to do every Saturday. Remember when cricket used to start on a Thursday? It would be planned to finish on the Tuesday. You'd have a day off on the Sunday. Every Saturday lunchtime, it would be a view from the boundary with Brian Johnson, with somebody who's usually nothing to do with cricket. My best example of that was when Jonathan Agnew recently did that with Lily Allen, and you just thought, why is Lily Allen interested in cricket? And she actually loves it. It's a fascinating interview. The reason I'm saying this is because if what we're talking about a professor doing is working at the boundaries, well, this is really a view from the boundary, what I'm going to be talking about now, or is it a view at the boundary, or across the boundary, or crossing the boundary? And hopefully this will begin to make a bit more sense as I go forward. I love that card, I love that picture, and it was given to me by my former boss, Sheila Kitchen, who was actually on the interview panel for my job here, Fiona, wasn't she? She gave me that card coming into this leadership role to say, Iain, that's probably what it's going to be like, but enjoy it. And I do. As you can see, I'm still doing this. I want to thank Carol Middleton now, Chief Executive of the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy, for when she was Chief Allied Health Professionals Officer, and you invited me to come to the first conference. In fact, I met you at the conference here that the faculty put together in 2009. I then went to the conference in October, and somebody asked you in an open session, what would be your one big bit of advice to people? And you said, get the emotional intelligence right. And actually that has started me on a journey. Whatever one thinks of emotional intelligence, for me it's been really helpful, and what underlies it. And I'm just going to unpick what I would see as being important about that. And for me, where that's led me actually is into some forms of different forms of meditation. And I would just highlight 3 different people I think who do that. Jon Kabat-Zinn started it, really, the whole idea of mindfulness, the East Coast of America in the 1970s, with patients who had pain, chronic pain. Mark Williams, lovely man from Oxford, is now taking that forward, and his main area of expertise is in suicide and people who actually take their own lives, and a lot of it is around how might mindfulness be able to help in that. And my personal favourite, which I'm very grateful to Malcolm Field for putting on to be, is Andy Puddicombe, who gets some Headspace, which is just a fantastic app. I still use it every day myself. So there's something about learning to control our attention, taking away the distraction, which I think has certainly been helpful for me in the leadership journey. Got a question for you. We're thinking about awareness. How long is the present? Well, if you're a psychologist and in the psychology field, it's actually apparently 2 to 3 seconds. A bit longer than I thought. I thought they might be saying it's infinitesimal, and there are some ways in which it's characterised like that. But generally, from the way that we engage with life, people would say that there's about 2 or 3 seconds that we've got, which is the present. Not living in the past, not living in the future. So that's a potential pause, I would suggest. Again, I realise there are massive holes in some of my arguments here, but as the ideas go forward, and this brings me back, and Phil, I don't know whether you probably don't remember this, when I was writing up the PhD, Phil was great at using red pen. I came to love...
I brought one with me.
Have you? We're coming over here, is it? So, I can remember the first time I saw a page without any red on it. Oh, what a day that was. What a day. Seriously, what a day that was. It's fantastic. But the biggest thing I remember is about a 40-minute conversation about commas. I don't think we agreed. Because for me, a comma is probably not much more than a pause. Excuse me, let me just get some water. And I'm also indebted to our Deputy Principal for Academic Affairs, Deborah Bowman, for tweeting this in January. Things I learned about writing a paper with your daughter. It will be the punctuation which most threatens your relationship. Typical Deborah, for those who know her. Lovely lady. So it's a very full slide. I would encourage all of you to go away and just think about that. Think about it, actually. It's from by a man called Paul Goodman, from Speaking in Language, The Defence of Poetry. I'm just going to focus on 2 bits here. He's saying there are basically different types of silence. I'm not going to spend the time going through all 9, but 2 that I think are relevant to what I'm talking about now, which is more about the management of leadership within higher education, is this idea of the fertile silence of awareness, pasturing the soul whence energy which emerge new thoughts, and the silence of listening to another speak, catching the drift and helping him be clear. There's something about the pause, and I think a silence in there, that is really helpful. I'm sure there are many of you who'd be able to say, Ian, sometimes you could do with listening to this yourself. I'm not trying to say here that I've got it all together. I'm just looking at it. And I'm grateful to Professor Brian Webster Henderson for an introduction to someone called Gillian Macready, who is a coach from Edinburgh, who did some work with us in the Council of Deans of Health, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but I've been on the executive of the Council of Deans of Health on and off for about the last 6 years. We had one day where Gillian came and did a session with us which was about this, really, and it was underpinned by Nancy Kline's Time to Think. And we reckon we got about a year's worth of work done in that day, didn't we? It was just mind-blowing that you could get people to engage that way with each other. And I try to do that here now. Georgina might say that we've tried to do that within the leadership team. Sometimes it works. There are some who are more bought into it than others. But actually, I think this giving people space and time to think and time to listen and time to express themselves creates the most incredible, not freedom for people just to talk, but actually the building of a story that is collective around those people in that room at that time. It's been really powerful. And my suggestion and my experience of that is that if you can take out of this the rush to judgment, and that underpinning it is this curiosity that's built within us as human beings, I think that's a bit of a winner. In and amongst all the emotion, and I was even checking myself this morning because I didn't get much sleep last night, and in our faculty management group this morning I found myself at times wanting to raise up, and I'm sure Andy was sensing, oh Ian, you're going off on one. Actually I just thought, no, just shut down, just shut up and start listening. And I tried to. Whether I succeeded or not I don't know, but I certainly was doing better than I probably would have done previously, because I just thought, actually let's just hear what everyone really has genuinely got to say. The other thing that we've done within the leadership team is we've tried to use the Myers-Briggs, so this whole idea of whether you are extroverted, introverted, whether you process information at a more strategic level or at a more detailed level, whether you make decisions by thinking or feeling, or whether you deal with the world and you want it to be all quite clear, or actually you're quite happy with it being not clear. With some success, but actually I think there's a problem with all of this, is that it's still suggesting you're one or the other, that there's one thing or they're not. And actually, we all span all of this all the time, don't we? I still think we're connected. Do we really make decisions, any of us, purely by what we think or purely by what we feel? There isn't really a difference between the thinking and the feeling. It is actually all part of each other. Yes, of course there's a difference, but actually there's this connection between all of those. And personally, I've wanted to use all these tools just to raise people's awareness of themselves and of others and how they might engage and work together. What really did it for me was going on the course at Cranfield, the Personal Transformation for Leaders course, which is to be always going beyond this idea of that framework and be just thinking for the other person and for themselves, what's the story here? Now, when I was on a leadership course with Florence Nightingale Foundation, there was one of the members there, when I had reacted in a certain way, she just said, I wonder what that's about, Ian. And it wasn't like, oh, how dare you, because actually I'd probably quite offended her. She just said, what's that about then? And I can still hear Jane saying that to me now. It was 2 years ago, about now actually, where she said, I wonder what's that about, Ian? Why did you do that? A really helpful, non-judgmental, curiosity-driven question that was, what's the story behind that? And I think there's a real power in that. And I personally do try to use it in meetings. Okay, what's the story behind why that person has said what they've said? What's the story that's building here? I've really gone way off beat here, haven't I? Starting at reflexes and then going up to life stories. I think where I'm headed here is to think, even if you think down at the synaptic level, or you think at the bigger level of individuals' interactions, or you think between organisations, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. Am I doing all right time-wise, Jenny? Oh, I probably do need to stop actually a minute, don't I? What's the story going on there, whether it's at synaptic level or between individuals or between organisations? What's the story that's going on there? And how might you be able to create something that isn't a stimulus that produces a response, but that we can actually work together and be more connected? Okay. Is it awareness with curiosity? I'm going to go very quickly through this, because obviously I have sort of gone over time a little bit. Within my professorial application, how did I become a professor? Well, a lot of it was to do with this professional working that I talked about, and about internal boundaries, working across internal boundaries, innovative high quality education, external governance and advisory role work, and I do quite a lot of that externally. Really disappointed not to be able to go to the Chief Allied Health Professions Officer conference today with Suzanne Rastrick, because I was preparing for this, obviously. And there's three groups I just want to talk about, and I probably will then just truncate it. There are other questions that I was going to throw in, but I've obviously gone on a little bit too long. There's three bits of external governance work that I do, which I think has been some of my proudest work, actually. I'd say whether it qualified me to get the chair or not, I don't know. When I was on the board of the YMCA London South West. And if you think about the YMCA, this was about 10 years ago. If you think YMCA, you probably think basketball, volleyball. In fact, they invented the games. And when we went into that, Richard James encouraged me to go in as that. He was the chief exec. It was all about fitness. And what we worked through, working with government policy and how it's all been characterised, we went from fitness to health and well-being. We're doing the same at my daughter's school, Kingston Academy, which is sponsored by Kingston University, where I'm now seen as the person who's actually been interested in well-being. And I think that's a really nice crossover for how universities can work, and my expertise and understanding of well-being and where that is, particularly as a physiotherapist with physical activity, and how we can then at a governance level influence that. I'm really proud of the work that I'm doing with the Council of Deans. I'm back on the executive again now. In fact, as Jenny said later, I'm treasurer. Earlier on, I'm treasurer, and we're looking to go through a governance review, which I'm working with Brian and the team on that. And the final thing I'm going to say, and then I will just wrap up because I have gone on, haven't I, is I think one of the proudest things I'm doing now is to be on the board, along with Karen, of AHP's Into Action, which is, if you haven't seen it, go and put that hashtag into Twitter. I tell you, that's been one of the best successes for allied health professions, the invisible professions, quite frankly, a lot of the time. It's been one of the best hashtags that you'll ever come across. And there are other slides, but I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure that I've run over time. So thank you very much for listening and hearing the story.
Well, Iain fascinates me. He's got so many attributes that we die for. He's super bright. He's accomplished, he's done so many things. You can't be with him and not learn something new, and it's usually, like today, something you didn't expect to learn. Yes, he is assertive, but he's a profoundly modest man, and I hope don't mind me saying, Iain, but we had many conversations about your application to Professor, which I thought was long overdue. And I was sitting on Iain's very glorious CV for a long time, and unlike Jenny, I couldn't find a copy today, so I thought, when did I last have that brilliant CV? So I contacted the Professorial Appointments Committee, and do you know what they said? You can't have it back, GDPR, data protection. I said to them, you should be very reassured that they look after your data so well, but what am I going to do? Well, speak from the heart. The other thing I would say about Iain is he's profoundly helpful, as you know. There have been a number of times over the last few years when we've been having problems, and he's stepped into the breach and really saved the show. He is a Professor of Health Education, but as we've learned, he's very accomplished in research, he's very accomplished in practice, and he said to me today, rather nicely, gosh, this is very nerve-wracking doing an inaugural, and I said, yes it is, yeah, no getting away from that. He said, yes, it's the only time possibly that you'll be talking to your colleagues and your family. Yeah, very nerve-wracking. Well, I didn't say. And think about it, Iain, it's much worse if you're a Professor of Healthcare Education, because people are going to be expecting to be wowed that you're going to be brilliant. I didn't say that because that would have been cruel, but of course he has done a brilliant presentation. And I'm sorry at the time, it doesn't do justice to all of your work. There are muscles in there, I have to say, that I don't think I ever knew existed. What I didn't know about you was that we had the same hero. I'm a big Richard Feynman fan too, so that's interesting. He didn't like psychiatrists very much, let me tell you, but he was a very brilliant mind, and it's interesting to see your inspiration from that. What I would like to thank you for, but can't, is the book on teenage minds. If you told me that before my son's 20th birthday last week, it would have been very, very, very helpful. But I fear that door has bolted. Finally, Ian, I think you make us very proud. The faculty sent off your CV with the strongest recommendation, and the university sent back the response with the strongest support. But of course, you had to go out to referees, international and otherwise, and they came back unanimously supporting your position. So I would ask you to stop being shy about claiming the, as you were today, modestly, your professorial title, because you absolutely deserve it. You are not just a terrific ambassador for academic physiotherapy, but in your head of school role, you are an absolute champion of all of the subjects that you represent. So Ian, in case you should have any doubt, argues vocally for midwifery, social care, he sings praises. And you really are somebody who puts your colleagues first, and it's a very great quality that you have. And you of course represent us so ably, not just on the Council of Deans at Kingston Academy, but in other places. And of course, we're very honoured that Suzanne Rastrick, for example, comes to visit us on your invitation so regularly. I've probably gone on. I'm the guy between you and wine or soft drinks up on the second floor, so I'm going to wrap up. But I'd like you to join with me in congratulating this wonderful academic. I can see Fiona, of course, who's known Ian even longer, on his professorial position and a wonderful inaugural. So Ian, thank you.